The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our webinar on meeting the ACNC governance standards. Our main presenter today is Annie Keeley, who is the Director of Compliance here at the ACNC.
Good morning.
We also have Natasha Sekulik. Natasha is one of the ACNC lawyers and she will be chiming in today on some tricky issues that come up throughout the presentation.
Hello.
Joining us is April from our advice team, who will be answering any questions you may have along the way.
Hi everyone.
Throughout the presentation, you can ask a question at any time in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. April will be able to answer your questions directly, but if she thinks the questions would be useful for everyone, she can also respond in a way that will allow everybody to see the question and also the answer, but not who asked it. Please let us know if you would like your question to remain private. If there are any questions we can't answer today, we'll provide the answers later. And finally, I'm Lucas Ryan. I'm a Senior Education and Policy Officer here at the ACNC, and I will be moderating today's session. The purpose of this webinar is to explain what the ACNC governance standards are, how they apply, and what charities can do to make sure that they're meeting them. A recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. If you have any difficulties with the sound on your computer, try calling the phone number listed in the control panel. Finally, we value any suggestions you may have to improve our webinars in the future, so please pass on your suggestions in the survey at the end of this session. Today's session will run for approximately 1 hour and will cover these 4 topics. To begin, we will understand what we mean by governance and briefly explain what it looks like for charities. We will then talk through each of the governance standards and briefly explain and what they require, and consider some of the examples taken from a range of real cases that demonstrate some of the challenges charities can have in meeting them. We will also provide some examples of steps you can take to meet these standards. And finally, we will look at some of the common issues that our compliance team have observed with charities over the last couple of years. I'll be back at the end of this session to explain where you can go for more information and how to get in contact with the ACNC. But for now, I'll hand over to Annie to talk you through today's presentation. Annie.
Thank you, Lucas. So, what do we mean when we talk about governance? There are many different definitions proposed for the meaning of governance. The ACNC suggests that governance refers to the processes, activities and relationships in your charity that make sure your charity is effectively and properly run. Governance plays a central role in the life of charities, but how it looks in practice can vary. Some of the common examples of governance activities charities are involved with are holding meetings to make sure that your members are kept informed about your charity's activities, setting a strategy and monitoring the work of an organisation to ensure that it aligns with the strategy, or documenting roles and responsibilities of the people involved within the organisation. So now let's look at the governance standards themselves. The governance standards are the minimum requirements for governance of charities. They are principle-based and help charities to remain trusted by the public and continue to do their charitable work. They are not a description of best practice in governance, but rather a set of minimum standards that all charities must meet. Charities must meet the ACNC's governance standards in order to become registered as a charity with the ACNC and to remain registered. And the governance standards are set out in the ACNC regulations. These standards are additional to other requirements your charity might have. For example, small incorporated associations aren't required to have annual general meetings under the governance standards, but they may be required to do so under their state or territory laws. Also, the ACNC has other requirements for charities, such as submitting an annual information statement, and keeping records of activities and finances. You should make sure that you're aware of these obligations and that your charity is meeting them. You should also be aware that there is a very specific category of charities that are not required to meet the governance standards. They're called basic religious charities. There's more information about this category available on our website at acnc.gov.au/basic religious charity. And of course, a basic religious charity can still choose to meet the governance standards, even though it's not required. So let's look at each of the governance standards in turn. The first governance standard requires charities to demonstrate that their purposes and character are not-for-profit, to comply with their purposes and character, and to provide information about their charitable purposes to the public. So what does it mean to be not-for-profit? A not-for-profit is an organisation that does not operate for the profit, personal gain or other benefit of particular people. For example, its members, the people who run it, or their friends or relatives. A not-for-profit can make profits as long as the profit is used for the not-for-profit purpose. Your purposes and character may be demonstrated in your governing documents. If, for example, the purpose of relieving poverty was stated in the governing documents of a charity, that would satisfy the relevant part of the standard. However, some charities may not have conventional governing documents and must demonstrate their purpose and character through other means. You must show you are complying with your not-for-profit purposes. The steps you must take to comply with this standard depend on factors such as the size and the extent to which you receive donations, grants and money from the public. For example, if you collect donations, the ACNC would expect you to have accounting systems in place to ensure the money is directed to your charitable purposes. If the charity is making payments to responsible persons or their associates for services provided to the charity, the ACNC would expect you to be able to show the decision to make those payments was properly made at arm's length and that those payments are not excessive. If you're transferring significant amounts of money overseas, for example to provide humanitarian aid, you must demonstrate your assistance was delivered as intended for the not-for-profit purposes and not diverted for purposes such as private benefit or at the extreme end to use to fund terrorist activities. Finally, you must make information about your purposes public. The ACNC asked all charities to file governing documents with their 2014 Annual Information Statement, and they are published on the ACNC register, and doing this will satisfy that relevant part of the standard. Let's consider a case study. At this point, I want to remind you that while the case studies we give in this webinar are inspired by real cases we have responded to, they are not de-identified examples of compliance cases. These case studies are examples only. So take, for example, a medium-sized charity that's undertaking fundraising activities in several different states and territories within Australia. Through its fundraising, it generates a significant amount of money. The charity did not appear to be undertaking any charitable activity, but was making significant payments to the charity's responsible persons, the members of its board. We are alerted to this issue and through our investigations determined that the charity was not complying with its purpose and character as a not-for-profit and was in breach of this governance standard. It appeared that the charity's true purpose was to raise money to provide payment to the charity's board members. This is not to say a charity cannot pay its responsible persons, but it must be able to show that the payments are not excessive and that any conflict of interest is well managed. Then the ACNC can be confident that the charity only exists for a charitable purpose and that it's meeting the requirements under this standard. On to number 2. Governance Standard 2 requires charities to be accountable and transparent to members. This standard only applies to charities that have members, for example, incorporated associations and companies limited by guarantee. It does not apply to charitable trusts. If a charity is already meeting the requirements of incorporated associations legislation in a state or territory, it will also be complying with this governance standard. If a charity is a company registered under the Corporations Act and meets requirements under that Act, it would also be complying with this standard. In fact, because those Corporations Act obligations are now switched off for charities, this standard increases the flexibility of charities that are companies to decide how best to be accountable to their members. For example, corporate charities no longer have to hold annual general meetings, although you may still decide to hold meetings to comply with the standard, or if your governing document requires you to hold an annual general meeting. Natasha, we've had questions from people when they signed up to attend a webinar about whether charities that are registered with ASIC still need to comply with the Corporations Act or just the governance standards. Can you please clarify that for us?
Sure, Annie. With the introduction of the ACNC Act and the governance standards, a number of provisions in the Corporations Act no longer apply to registered charities that are incorporated as companies. These generally relate to obligations under the Corporations Act, which have equivalent or similar obligations under the ACNC Act. Broadly speaking, there are 4 obligations in the Corporations Act that no longer apply to charities. 1. Charities are no longer required to provide certain notifications to ASIC when they change their constitution, company address, or directors. Similar or equivalent obligations now exist to the ACNC. 2. Charities now report their financial information, if required, to the ACNC rather than to ASIC. 3. Certain civil directors' duties in the Corporations Act have been switched off, and instead the governance standards require charities to make sure its directors are subject to and comply with some equivalent duties. 4. And finally, the requirements in the Corporations Act relating to meetings of members have been switched off. Instead, Governance Standard 2 requires a charity to be accountable to members, but does not stipulate exactly how this must be done. So that's a very quick rundown of the changes in the Corporations Act. The ACNC has a fact sheet for companies limited by guarantee, which goes through this in a lot more detail and explains exactly which obligations have moved from ASIC to the ACNC.
Thanks, Natasha. Some things you could do to meet Governance Standard 2 are hold meetings with your members, such as annual general meetings or special general meetings. Make sure that you're providing suitable notice periods before meetings so that everyone involved in your charity has a reasonable opportunity to attend. Have a minimum quorum for meetings, that is, a minimum number of people that must be present in order for the meeting to go ahead. Run fair and transparent elections for the appointment of the members to your charities, of your charity's responsible persons, and provide members with an opportunity to ask questions at meetings about the charity and how it is run, and that includes financial information and information about a charity's work towards achieving its purpose. Let's look at another case study. This time a charity that runs a centre for people who are experiencing homelessness. The charity was brought to our attention because its members had concerns about the governance of the charity. Their website had been taken down by a former responsible person. This person had resigned but had the login details for the charity's website and took it offline. After that, almost no information about the charity was available to members. Through our investigation, we found that the board was working hard to get the website back online and was making changes to improve governance within the charity. So the charity was taking positive steps, but it was failing to keep members informed as to their activities during this transition. This highlights how important it is to be accountable to your members especially in difficult times or if a charity is undergoing a period of change. Governance Standard 3 requires charities to give the public trust and confidence that their ongoing operations and assets are not put at risk through non-compliance with Australian laws. Note that a charity does not need to be actually charged with an indictable offence or given a penalty to be in breach of this standard. For example, if the ACNC reasonably believes that it's more likely than not that a charity has engaged in an offence of fraud, the charity would be in breach of this standard. The ACNC could take action, for example by issuing a formal warning, without the need for a prosecution to be completed. This allows the ACNC to protect a charity from potential ongoing misuse while legal proceedings are finalised. Governance Standard 4 requires charities to maintain, protect and enhance public trust and confidence in their governance and operations through ensuring that the people on its board are suitable. This means that they must not be 1. Disqualified from managing a corporation, or 2. Disqualified from being a responsible person by the ACNC. Although the ACNC and ASIC can disqualify persons and will list these persons on their respective registers, persons can be automatically disqualified from managing corporations. When this occurs, they will not necessarily be listed on the ACNC or ASIC registers. Two examples of matters that will result in automatic disqualification are: 1. If the person is convicted of an offence in contravention of the Corporations Act 2001, or of an offence involving dishonesty and is punishable by imprisonment of at least 3 months, or 2. If the person is an undischarged bankrupt. So it's important that you're aware of how someone can be automatically disqualified and consider what impact this might have on the eligibility of your board members to be responsible persons. There are a number of steps you can take to make sure your charity is meeting Governance Standard 4. As a first step, you should check the ASIC and ACNC registers of disqualified persons to ensure that none of your charity's responsible persons appear on this list. It may also be a good idea to ask your responsible persons to sign a declaration which states that they are: 1. Not currently disqualified from managing the corporation. As I mentioned, there are some things that may automatically disqualify you. And 2. That if they become ineligible, they will notify the charity. Of course, if any of your responsible persons do not meet these requirements, you'll need to take steps to remove them. It's a good idea to start with asking them to stand aside, but it may be necessary to take further steps too. There is a declaration that a charity can use for this purpose on the ACNC website, which you may like to have a look at. Governance Standard 5 is the last and the most significant of the standards, both in terms of what it requires charities to do and also the number of issues we see in charities. This governance standard requires a charity to be sure its responsible persons follow 7 duties. These duties come from the common law and have well-established meanings. The first duty requires charities exercise a degree of care and diligence in their roles, such as reading any papers, turning up for meetings on time and making sure they're appropriately informed about the matter before they're going to be making a decision. Duty number 2 requires that responsible persons always act honestly and fairly, but importantly in the best interests of the charity. When you become a board member of a charity, you accept a duty to act in its best interests, and you must ensure that you're always doing so when acting as a board member, and that you do so in a way that's consistent with your charity's charitable purpose. The third and fourth duties require that you do not use any information you gain in your position as a board member or the position itself in any way that is improper. For example, if you gain access to confidential information in the course of your work as a board member, this must only be used for the purpose of informing any decisions you make on the board and must not be used or passed on for any other purpose. Under the fifth duty, a responsible person who has or may appear to have a material conflict of interest in a decision being made by the directors should tell the other responsible persons about it, and then once the other directors are told about the interest, the charity may also need to take steps to ensure the conflict is managed appropriately. The sixth duty you have is to ensure that your charity's financial affairs are managed responsibly. This means understanding your charity's financial position and making decisions which will not endanger its financial health. This duty is not intended to discourage you from being innovative or taking risks, but rather to encourage charities to maintain appropriate financial systems and procedures to ensure its ongoing financial sustainability. And finally, the seventh duty, you must ensure that your charity does not operate while it is insolvent. This means that your charity must be able to pay its debts as and when they fall due. We've had a question that relates to the sixth and seventh duties, which is what level of financial literacy should a board member have to make sure these requirements are met? Lucas, can you explain what the sixth and seventh duties require, please?
Sure, Annie. Generally speaking, a responsible person is required to have an understanding of financial concepts and financial literacy that will enable them to make informed decisions about a charity's finances. At the very least, you should be able to determine whether your charity is solvent and what the impact of any decision you make is likely to be on its financial health. As a responsible person, you are required to be informed about any matter about which you will make a decision. You cannot make an informed decision about a charity's finances without an understanding of the financial concepts that relate to them. Of course, you can seek and, up to a point, rely on the advice of an expert, but you must not do so blindly. You must have enough knowledge that you are able to question any professional advice you are given, recognize any inconsistencies, and identify any problems with the advice. Professional advisors play an important role within charities, but these duties require that you still ask questions when necessary when you are receiving advice. Of course, the amount of understanding required will vary depending on the complexity and size of your charity's finances. What would be expected of a charity with a very small budget would be different to the expectations on a responsible person for a charity with a multi-million-dollar budget. If you are concerned that your level of knowledge is not high enough to meet your duties, it might be a good idea to consider whether you should undertake some training on financial literacy. There are a number of providers that offer training on financial literacy which are tailored for not-for-profit audiences. In the end, your financial knowledge must be reasonable to the circumstances of your charity. Consider your charity's nature, the scale of its operations, the complexity of its finances, and ask what financial knowledge you need to possess as a responsible person that will enable you to make informed decisions.
Thanks for that, Lucas. Some of the other things a charity can do to make sure its responsible persons meet the duties in Governance Standard 5 are providing a letter of appointment to your responsible persons that sets out what their duties are under this governance standard. A letter such as this can also be a great way to set out any other expectations you have of board members. Many charities provide information to their board members that will help them to understand and meet their duties. There are a number of useful guides available which explain the duties in detail and which can help responsible persons to understand how they apply to them. You could also consider arranging training for responsible persons if required. And of course, if you think that your responsible persons do not know or are not meeting their duties, take action. The members of the board should feel comfortable openly discussing their duties and should hold each other to account for ensuring that they are met. Let's consider a case study on the duties of responsible persons. We recently came across a charity that had operated nationally through having an online presence, which allowed them to fundraise in several different states and territories. It was alleged by one of the charity's volunteers that some of the money they had raised was being made available as interest-free loans to the responsible persons. In our investigations, we found that this was indeed occurring. We determined that the charity's responsible persons were failing to act in the best interests of the charity and ensuring that the charity's assets were put towards their charitable purpose. Rather, in this case, the responsible persons were acting in their own interest and using these assets for their own private benefit. As such, the responsible persons were failing to meet their duties and so not complying with the governance standards. In May 2015, the ACNC released a compliance report which reflects on what we've learned from our compliance activities so far, what we have achieved, and what our compliance focus will be in the future. Governance is an underlying theme in the report. About 3/4 of substantiated concerns relate to breaches of the governance standards. Concerns raised with the ACNC range over a number of topics, but the three most common issues raised in cases the ACNC sees are record keeping, where a charity has poorly organised, incomplete, or in some cases no records whatsoever. Poor record keeping is a common indicator of broader governance concerns, but it can also raise problems by itself. For example, poorly kept records can make it difficult to identify and prevent fraud at charities, and so can represent a major concern. Failing to meet the requirements of being a not-for-profit organisation is also a recurring theme in our compliance cases. These are the cases where we see inappropriate private benefit or where charities are working towards purposes that are not charitable. And finally, failing to demonstrate accountability to members is also a common theme in cases we investigate. These issues are common to many of the compliance cases we encounter and can be useful indicators of more significant governance problems within a charity. As the ACNC continues to receive more information about charities through its annual information statements, we are building a better picture of the charity sector. We will use this information to proactively identify non-compliance in the future and help more charities to comply. In the next 12 to 18 months, our compliance focus will be to ensure charities report their information accurately and on time. We will also focus on charities that provide private benefits to their responsible persons or associates, and to charities that operate overseas to ensure that they protect their assets against the risk of being misused for terrorist financing. And finally, charities that may be involved in illegal activity or tax avoidance type structures. But we will also continue to have a focus on governance standards and help charities meet the minimum requirements, which of course is the purpose of this webinar.
Thank you for that, Annie, and also to Natasha for taking us through the governance standards today. We know that charities often have questions about the governance standards. There is a lot of information available on our website about these standards and on all of the obligations that registered charities have to the ACNC. I've included some links on this slide to some of the information most relevant, but we will also ensure that these links are sent out to you all in a follow-up email. You will be able to download these slides, the slides from this webinar, in a couple of days from our website. Here I've listed links that will take you to pages about the governance standards, the ongoing obligations of registered charities, some governance tools, which include some quick tips and templates you can use, basic religious charities, which Annie discussed earlier and which are a special type of charity that are not required to meet the governance standards, companies limited by guarantee or CLGs, which we mentioned in today's presentation, and the ACNC's compliance report, which Annie spoke about before, and which provides information about some of the ACNC's work in compliance over the last couple of years. You may also be interested in our guide, Governance for Good, which explains some of the central concepts in governance and how they relate to charities. It is available for download on our website. All these resources can be easily found by visiting the website at acnc.gov.au. Well, we're nearing the end of the webinar now, but if you do want to get in touch with us, you can do so in a number of ways. You can find out more information about the ACNC's program of webinars at acnc.gov.au/webinars. You can also call us on 13ACNC or 132262. Our phone lines are open between 9 AM and 6 PM, and they are staffed by helpful people like April who understand the charity sector and can provide advice on how charities can meet their obligations to the ACNC. Our staff are trained to give general advice on a range of topics related to the regulation of charities. You can also email them at advice@acnc.gov.au, and this is a particularly good idea if your issue is complex or if you think it will need detailed consideration. Of course, we're also active on social media, so you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. And that brings us now to the end of our webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. We hope that this has been useful to you and has helped you to further your understanding of the governance standards. These webinars run at least monthly and cover a range of topics. The next in this series will be held on Monday the 9th of November and will focus on the duties of responsible persons. You can sign up to attend this webinar and any others at acnc.gov.au/webinars. A recording and transcript of this webinar and any future webinars will be available on this page as well. We are always looking for ways to improve our education products, and so we would appreciate it if you took the time to fill out the evaluation for this webinar, which will be emailed to you in the coming days. If you have any additional comments or questions, you can get in touch with the ACNC education team directly at education@acnc.gov.au. Well, that's it from me. Thank you to Annie and Natasha for presenting and April for answering questions. Thanks also to everybody who participated, and we'll see you next time.